Let's proceed to the third argument. Remember, there was gratitude and consent. Now let's discuss fairness. And here the intuitive idea seems to be the following. It's not about consent, but it's close. It's close in the following way. Even if you haven't given your consent, even if, say, we can't read implicit consent, or if you're living here, participating with us in all sorts of social practices, still it seems like you are benefiting quite seriously from all the goods that the general practice of obedience to law helps to make possible. And if you're benefiting from this practice, shouldn't you also be willing to shoulder your part of the burden, whatever needs to be the case, for this practice to continue, to survive, to prosper? So some people offer what is sometimes called as a fairness principle. It's often associated with John Rawls. And here is at least one rough version of it. If a person enjoys the fruits of a practice, and if that practice has costs, then the person morally ought to bear a fair share of these costs. Now, whether this can establish a duty to obey the law remains to be seen, but I think we have to admit that this principle at least has some intuitive plausibility to it. And so, here's the argument. Pretty much everyone enjoys the fruits of general obedience to law. Now let's plug in the fairness principle from the previous bullet point. And what follows from these together is that pretty much all those who enjoy the benefits of the practice of a general obedience to law, all of them ought to shoulder their fair share of the costs of the obedience principle. The fact that everyone obeys is a benefiting practice. It has costs. Everyone should shoulder their part of the burden. The way in which you shoulder your part of the burden is by obeying the law. So here's a different argument, I think an interesting one, for a general moral duty to obey the law. Notice that consent does not play a role here. What does is fairness, the thought that if you're benefiting from a practice, you should also, as it were, chip in. You should do your share. Let's see then if this argument, the argument from fairness, can withstand criticism. One thing that you may question about this argument is the fairness principle itself. Remember, that was the principle that if you're benefiting from a practice, you should bear you should shoulder your part of the burden. But at least as stated, it seems to be very strong. And remember, we're looking for an argument that's an alternative to a consent-based argument, not one that presupposes consent. So the crucial question to ask now becomes, do we have a duty to shoulder our share of the burden even without having consented to the relevant practice? If we have consented, presumably, this establishes our duty. But we're not talking about consent right now. The thought that whenever you're enjoying a practice, there arises a moral duty to chip in, even if you haven't consented to that practice, even if you wouldn't have consented had they asked you on time. You just didn't want it at all. It's just that it's out there now, and so you're enjoying. So suddenly you have a duty. That thought seems to many to be way too restrictive of liberty. It seems to be too cheap on how duties can arise. And if we're going for a qualified version of the fairness principle, one that's not quite as strong, it's not clear that the qualified version can still play its role in the argument from the previous slide. Okay, put that to one side now. Let's assume that something in the vicinity of a general fairness principle holds. Remember, the first premise in the argument was that all pretty much enjoy the fruits of the general practice of obedience to law. But it's not clear that that's true. There are some people who presumably don't. Think about people who don't just sometimes suffer from the force of the state or of the law, but who routinely do. Oppressed minorities, perhaps, or perhaps a subset of oppressed minorities. With regard to them, it's not clear that they, by and large, even as a kind of all things considered judgment, having taken everything into account, that they benefit from the practice of obedience to law. They may be the ones paying the prices for it. If so, the fairness argument does not apply to them. And we have a problem with generality. So it does not apply to all the people we want a moral justification for a duty to obey the law to apply to. Now this is, I think, a problem, but I'm not sure it's a problem for the fairness argument. It may be a problem for the state, in which there are some citizens who don't enjoy the general practice of obedience to law. So if there are such citizens who don't benefit from this general practice, if there are minorities who are so seriously oppressed that the overall balance of the general practice of obedience to law is negative, as far as they are concerned, then perhaps restricting generality makes sense here. Perhaps they actually do not have a moral duty to obey the law, or perhaps they don't have a moral duty to obey the law in the same way and as weighty as the rest of us do. So I'm not sure that this is a theoretical problem with this argument. It may be a political problem. But perhaps most importantly, even assuming the first premise, namely that everyone benefits from a general practice to obey the law, and even assuming the general fairness principle, though, as we saw, it may be questioned, it's still not at all clear that the conclusion of the argument, namely a general duty to obey the law, follows. What does follow is that you should shoulder a fair share of the burden, you should chip in. But there are many ways of shouldering your part of the burden. Perhaps you can shoulder it in alternative ways. Perhaps you can just send a lot of money to the local police force, or in some other ways help sustain the general practice of obedience to law. It seems like if it's just about chipping in, if it's just about shouldering a part of the burden, it's not at all clear that the only way to do that would be obedience. Well, suppose then I am a major contributor to law enforcement in my political environment. Does it then follow that I no longer have a duty to obey? The fairness argument seems to answer positively. Intuitively, we seem to answer negatively. And so the fairness argument does not seem to capture what we want here. Okay, so here's the fourth kind of argument that I'm going to be discussing, and it's the last one. And it's an argument from consequences. At least in decent states, at least across many circumstances, though not necessarily all, it seems like a general practice of obedience seems to have good results. I mean, consider the alternative, right? And it's important that for now, you don't think about the really exciting cases of the draft and the war, and maybe we should all be conscientious objectors and so on. We'll get to that shortly. Rather, think about the boring cases, cases like taxes and traffic regulations, and perhaps something about regulating markets and contracts and so on. So it seems very clear that in at least many cases, a general practice of obedience to the law seems to have good results. Well, doesn't that suffice to justify a duty to obey the law? Remember, we're talking about a fairly limited duty. It may not apply to all cases, just to most cases. It's only a pro tanto duty. Well, doesn't that suffice for a pro tanto moral duty to obey the law? The fact that if you obey the law, better things will happen than if you don't. So this is a very natural thought. But it's also problematic. It's problematic because at this point, it's not clear that the law does any work. If it's true, in general, that if you do something, better results will follow, better consequences will follow than if you don't, then you already have a reason to do it, or maybe, in some cases, even a duty to do it. You don't need the law for that, right? It's a general duty to do good, or to avoid doing harm, or not to do too much harm, or something along these lines. So it seems like the specific duty to obey the law somehow drops out of the picture. In order to avoid this result, what we should focus on when we are offering the argument from consequences as a possible argument for a duty to obey the law, what we should be focusing on are not the good consequences or bad consequences of a specific act of obedience, because these are covered anyway by the general duty you have not to harm or perhaps to do good. What we should focus on are the good consequences that follow not from a specific act of obedience, but from a general practice of obedience. And it's not hard to see that there are such things. So one of the things that make driving possible, even if not a pleasure, is that you can by and large rely on other people obeying the law, at least within certain bounds. It's not just that if you don't obey the law now, serious risks may ensue and there may be very, very bad consequences. It's also that you're enjoying the general practice where you can rely on other people pretty much obeying the traffic regulations. So once we go from the specific case to the good or bad consequences of the general practice of obedience, the law no longer drops out of the picture. And these are the consequences we should focus on if we're interested in a general duty to obey the law. Notice that once we are moving to the good consequences of the general practice of obedience, once we've moved to this general way of thinking about things, then arguments from consequences may be able to give us all that we have wanted. In particular, they may give us content-neutral duties. You have a duty to obey the law, whatever it says, because although the consequences of a specific act of obedience will differ depending on what the law says, the consequences of a general practice of obedience depend on everyone obeying the law content neutrally. And you can also find room here for at least some mistakes. You will have a very strong reason to follow the law even when the law falls short of an ideal, because of the general good consequences of a practice of obedience. Now, you may have heard the term consequentialism. Consequentialism is a family of views in moral philosophy that, roughly stated, according to which the right thing to do is always that thing among your alternatives that will maximize the good, or that will have the best consequences overall. And it's important to note that not everyone is a consequentialist. Jeremy Bentham is, but others, not everyone else is. So it's important to see that the argument from consequence is not only available to consequentialists. What's unique to consequentialism is the thought that the single factor that determines the moral status of an action are its consequences. The only thing that may affect whether the action is right or wrong are its consequences. But we don't need that in order to see that consequences matter. In fact, everyone thinks that consequences matter. Of course, whether or not it's morally permissible to do something may depend on its consequences, among perhaps other things. Or it may depend on its expected consequences, perhaps among other things. So the argument for consequences is not a consequentialist argument, or anyway, not necessarily a consequentialist argument. People who reject consequentialism can still think that you have a moral duty often not to do things that will have very bad consequences. And this is all we're assuming right now. So for now, the argument from consequences is still standing. It seems convincing to an extent, although it's somewhat limited. It's somewhat limited, perhaps because it's limited to only decent states. These need not be democratic states. These have to be states, remember the non-exciting cases, traffic regulations, taxes, and so on. They have to be states that at least allow you to do that at least give you the benefits of decent traffic regulations and taxes that allow for, I don't know, schools and hospitals, things like that. So it still has to be, the argument can only apply, obviously, if by and large obedience has good consequences. That may apply more widely than just democracies, but it doesn't apply to every political entity, perhaps just decent states or something like that. Also, it may only apply in standard circumstances. There may be circumstances, perhaps a kind of a political breakdown circumstances, in which obedience no longer has, by and large, good consequences. In that case, obviously, the argument ceases to have an effect. Also notice that it's limited in the following way. It may justify a general duty to obey the law, but it's not clear that what it will have to say about a specific act. So what if there's a specific act that you're considering in which breaking the law will not have bad consequences? Not just in the specific way we've described, but won't even deteriorate the general practice of obedience, won't have bad consequences even in terms of undermining that general practice. There are presumably many cases of breaking the law that share this feature. If no one will find out, if you won't be caught, if no other serious harm will be done. And it seems like if the only justification for a moral duty to obey the law is consequence-based in the ways we've been outlining, then that duty will not apply to the cases in which violation will not even have bad effects on the general practice of obedience. So the argument perhaps doesn't go as far as you may have wanted initially when you thought that obviously we have a moral duty to obey the law, but at least the argument goes some of the way in that direction, and it's not without force. Okay, so much then for our critical survey of possible justifications for a moral duty to obey the law. Now suppose there is a moral duty to obey the law. Remember, a moral duty, a pro tanto duty, possibly outweighable or defeasible later on by other considerations, and perhaps limited in scope. But still, suppose there is such a duty. What follows? Obviously, many questions remain. As I've just emphasized yet again, even though we want the duty to obey the law to be at least somewhat general, it doesn't mean that it's fully general. So you may want to ask, in which cases does it apply? And perhaps more importantly, in which cases does it not apply? So you may think, for instance, that we have a general duty to obey the law that easily applies to traffic regulations, even to traffic regulations that are not as smart as they could have been. But they don't apply to other cases, like maybe to unjust laws. Right? So it's one thing for a traffic regulation to be less than fully smart. It's another for a restriction of freedom of speech to be unjust. And you may think that the duty to obey the law is just irrelevant in the latter cases. It doesn't apply to unjust cases, or maybe to other cases as well. So even if there is a general moral duty to obey the law, you may want to ask about its scope. Even within just those cases in which it applies, so within the scope of a moral duty to obey the law, as we've been emphasizing, it's merely a pro tanto moral duty to obey the law. And so other considerations may defeat it. So it may be really important to ask how weighty is the moral duty to obey the law, and what other considerations defeat it, and when. Maybe we can just, maybe all we can do is to consider specific cases on their merits without some general guiding principle. But maybe there are some guiding principles that we can go for. Perhaps, for instance, mere convenience considerations never trump a moral duty to obey the law. But perhaps considerations that have to do with political justice may rather easily outweigh a duty to obey the law. And perhaps we can even say something about the kind of cases in which that may be so. What this means is that the citizen may need to ask, and this is something that she may need to ask in general, but also on specific occasions. She may need to ask whether she should, in this case, even though a moral duty to obey the law applies, maybe she should break the law nonetheless, because other considerations, perhaps considerations having to do with themselves, with morality and with political justice, apply. And perhaps they apply and are more weighty, perhaps they are weighty enough to defeat, at least in this case, the general duty to obey the law. So these are questions, as it were, for you, a citizen. You should take it into account. You should try to determine what you should do in a case in which a moral duty to obey the law or purported moral duty to obey the law conflicts with other morally important considerations. But there are also other questions we can ask. For instance, we can ask now not about how the citizen should proceed, but about how the state should proceed when a citizen breaks the law for unprincipled grounds. And perhaps the most important thing for me to stress about this question is that it's a different question. It's a different kind of question. Different moral and perhaps other normative considerations apply. It's one thing for me to ask whether I should break the law on a specific occasion. It's another thing for the state to ask how it should respond to me breaking the law on principled grounds on that occasion. It's not clear that the same arguments or the same considerations apply. Here's one important difference. When I ask whether I should break the law, or when you ask yourself that, one of the things that we ask is whether the specific piece of legislation or regulation is unjust. And if so, how seriously unjust it is. Presumably, if it's unjust but really in a negligible way, the duty to obey the law outweighs this kind of injustice. But if it's more seriously unjust, maybe not so. So for us, it's a really crucial question whether and to what extent the law is unjust. But when the state tries to determine how to respond to my disobedience, then from the point of view of the state, surely the law is just. That doesn't mean that it is just. It just means that the state cannot recognize its injustice. If it recognizes its injustice, what it should do is repeal it. So here's one example of a really important consideration that is different when the case is the case of the individual contemplating whether or not to refuse or whether or not to obey the law, and the state trying to determine how to respond to the individual's actions. Anyway, the fact that it's not merely breaking the law, but breaking the law on principled grounds certainly seems to be relevant. It seems to make a difference even to the appropriate response of the state. So we're not yet sure how exactly it makes or what difference it makes. But it seems to make a difference. If you're not sure, think about the following rather natural example. So think about two people who avoid the draft. One of them does it because they want to stay home, or because it's inconvenient to join the military now, or because they want to avoid risk to themselves, or something along these lines. The other does it because they have serious conscientious moral objections to the war. Now, both are breaking the law, and perhaps both should be punished, though this remains to be seen. But anyway, it seems hard to deny that they are different cases. It's an important difference with regard to a case of disobedience, whether it's on principled grounds or not. Right? The first just breaks the law the same way that a thief breaks the law with regard to property. The second, well, something more interesting is going on, and how the state should respond should be at least sensitive to that. In this context, in the context of asking about the appropriate response of the state, there's a very common distinction, also goes at least to John Rawls, probably goes back further, and that's a distinction that you may find both in theoretical texts on the matter, but also in actual court decisions, certainly in Israel, and I believe elsewhere as well. And it's the distinction between conscientious objection and civil disobedience. So let me say a few things about that distinction. So the case of conscientious objection is supposed, or the case of the conscientious objector, is supposed to be the case of someone saying, I cannot in good conscience do that. Perhaps I'm a pacifist for some religious reasons. My religion forbids me from doing that. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a war. I'm not saying that other people shouldn't be doing that. What I'm saying is that I cannot in good conscience do that. And often, if the case makes it to a court, I'm not just saying that, I'm also saying, and I want to be exempt from it because of perhaps a general consideration having to do with freedom of conscience. So conscientious objection is often presented as a very personal thing. Civil disobedience is often presented as a much more political thing. So that's the case of someone saying, well, it's not that I cannot do something, it's that I will not do it because it is unjust and I want to bring about political change. And one of the ways in which I want to bring about political change, perhaps because there's an absence of other efficient ways, is by breaking the law. So both the person engaging in conscientious objection and the one engaging in civil disobedience will break the law. Both of them will do it on principled grounds, but they are still different, so the story often goes. They are different in the kind of personal way that the conscientious objection says, I cannot do it in good conscience, and the more clearly political purposes of the person engaging in civil disobedience. The distinction thus understood is a distinction in terms of the underlying motivations of both of these agents. So the person engaging in conscientious objections, the main motivation is, well, it's not exactly clear, but it's sometimes put in terms of keeping one's conscience pure, something along these lines. Whereas the underlying motivation of a person engaging in civil disobedience is to bring about political change. One of the nice differences to which this distinction gives rise is the following. The conscientious objector will be violating a law, but the law that he or she will be violating is the very law to which they object on conscientious grounds, because they say, I can't do that in good conscience. Not necessarily so for the person engaging in civil disobedience. So if someone engages in civil disobedience, say, against the Israeli occupation of the territories occupied in 1967. One thing they may want to do is to refuse to serve in those territories. But another thing they may want to do is maybe to engage in illegal demonstrations and block some roads and things like that. That would be an act of civil disobedience. It's breaking a law on principled grounds in order to bring about a political change. But the law that they're breaking when they are blocking a road is not the same one to which they object on principled grounds. So that's a good indication that the case is a case of civil disobedience rather than a case of conscientious objection. Now I want to warn you against one way of putting that distinction, and that in fact I may have used it myself to an extent, and that's the way of saying that civil disobedience is political whereas conscientious objection is not. Now I emphasize the fact that conscientious objection is personal in a way that civil disobedience may not be. That's true. But I want you to be wary about such uses of the word political. It's a very unhelpful word here because it's used in many, many ways, and it's sometimes used in ways that prejudge the argument at stake. So some people say that the conscientious objections actions are political because political doesn't sound too good and they want to undermine him or her. But of course, it's quite possible that the conscientious objection wants to bring, that the person engaging, in civil disobedience, wants to bring about political change, and they want to bring about political change out of principled moral grounds. So there is something political going on, of course, but not political in any kind of deplorable sense of, just doing politics. It doesn't even have to involve party politics or anything along these lines. Also, if many people object to participating in a war effort on conscientious grounds, that does not mean that their action lacks a political context or political influence, and so political significance. So I don't think that the question is whether the relevant act of breaking the law is political. The distinction is in terms of the underlying motivation as I presented it. I want, however, to cast some doubt on that distinction. So it's true that states, by and large, are more forgiving of conscientious objection. It's not hard to see why, right? Conscientious objection is, by and large, much less threatening. These are just people saying, look, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying I can't participate, please exempt me. It's easier to show some largesse with regard to a person engaging in conscientious objection. But it's not clear, and sometimes it's even presented as a constitutional right. People have a constitutional right to freedom of conscience. That also applies in these cases. But I think that on reflection, it's not at all clear that the differential attitude of the state to conscientious objection and civil disobedience can be justified or defended. So I can see, as I just said, why civil disobedience is more threatening. But civil disobedience is not more or less principled. It's not necessarily less in good faith. It's not necessarily less virtuous than cases of conscientious objection. In fact, you may want to argue in the opposite direction. You may think that there is something more admirable about civil disobedience, because the person engaging in conscientious objection is roughly out to save his or her own soul. The person engaging in civil disobedience is out to bring about a political change that will presumably affect positively the lives of many others. So it's not clear to me at all that the person engaging in civil disobedience is any less admirable. Perhaps they're more admirable than the person engaging in conscientious objection. Also, the distinction between the underlying motivations, sort of to save one's soul or to bring about political change, that's a clean analytic distinction, and that's already good. But once you're talking about the real world, things are not as clean anymore. And in particular, what you may come up across, and I think what you often do come up across, are cases of what's called motivational overdetermination. What motivational overdetermination means is that many people are motivated by more than one motive. They're motivated at once by a conscientious objection to, say, a war effort, and also the morally grounded political conviction that change must be brought about. And these two kinds of motivations also interact in them psychologically and perhaps in other ways as well. And in those cases, the clean analytic distinction between the underlying motivations just no longer applies. And so it's no longer helpful to think about the case as either a case of civil disobedience or a case of conscientious objection. Most cases are just cases of both. So the distinction won't help the state to justifiably decide how to proceed. True, the state needs some test. It needs some rules about how to treat principled disobeyers. But I don't think that the helpful way of fleshing out those rules will be in terms of the distinction between conscientious objection and civil disobedience. Perhaps it'll be in terms of dangerousness, perhaps in other terms, sincerity. There's more stuff to think about here. And so we reach our concluding remarks for the session on the duty to obey the law. The question we were asking was, is there an at least somewhat general, somewhat content-independent, moral pro tanto duty to obey the law? That was the question. The anarchist offered a shortcut, that arguing that there cannot be such a duty, and I think we could rather easily dismiss that shortcut. So the next thing we were trying to do is to critically evaluate arguments for a moral duty to obey the law. And what we found out there is that most arguments under that rubric actually failed, some of them rather miserably. The argument from consequences didn't. Remember, it was somewhat limited in its conclusion, but still it seemed to offer at least some justification for a somewhat limited moral duty to obey the law. Even if it does succeed, the duty that it does establish does not seem to be too weighty, so that the room for it being defeated later on by other considerations seems to be very relevant indeed. You, I, other citizens, we should always consider whether a particular case, especially a problematic one, is one where the duty to obey the law is outweighed by other weightier moral considerations. As for the state's appropriate response to such cases, well, it's complicated, of course. I'm sure you weren't assuming that it wasn't. But it's not clear that a good way around this complication would be by employing the distinction between civil disobedience and conscientious objection. The state may need to use other devices altogether.